If you're so unhappy, why don't you move out? My dad said. I covered $15,000 in utilities, groceries, and repairs while they took over my house. My sister took my bedroom. My parents took my peace. When I asked for 1 week alone, Mom scoffed. You're being selfish. That night, I packed in silence. At sunrise, I transferred the deed, and the locksmiths arrived before breakfast. I, 32M, never thought I'd become a stranger in my own house. But that's exactly what happened when my parents moved in temporarily 3 years ago. It started when Dad lost his job and Mom's health issues drained their savings. They needed a place to stay while getting back on their feet, and I had a 3-bedroom house with just me living in it. Being their son, I opened my doors without hesitation. What I didn't expect was for temporary to become permanent, and for my generosity to be taken as weakness. Within 6 months, they had completely rearranged my living room furniture to suit their preferences. Mom claimed the kitchen was too cramped for her cooking style and convinced me to renovate it. Dad took over my garage workshop, moving all my tools to make room for his projects. When my sister lost her apartment due to a messy breakup, she naturally moved into my guest room without even asking. But the real breaking point came when my sister decided she preferred my master bedroom because it had the better view and bigger closet. She simply moved her things in one weekend while I was visiting friends, claiming the smaller guest room would be perfect for me since I was single anyway. When I protested, Mom sided with her, saying my sister needed the space more than I did after going through such a difficult time. I found myself sleeping in what used to be my guest room while paying all the utilities, groceries, property taxes, and any repairs that came up. The house felt suffocating. Every corner held reminders that I was no longer the homeowner, but merely another resident, and apparently the least important one at that. Dad had found part-time work, but spent most of his income on his hobbies. Mom's health had improved significantly, but she made no moves toward finding their own place. My sister treated me like an annoying younger brother rather than the person providing her free housing. Family dinners became uncomfortable affairs where I felt like an outsider at my own table. The utility bills alone were crushing me. What used to be a manageable monthly expense had tripled with 4 adults in the house. The grocery bills were astronomical. Mom insisted on buying organic everything and premium brands, while Dad's appetite seemed to have no limits. My sister contributed nothing financially, but had plenty of opinions about how things should be run. I started working overtime just to keep up with the expenses. My social life disappeared because I was either working or too exhausted to go out. Dating became impossible when bringing someone home meant navigating around my entire family, who treated every visitor like an intrusion. The repairs were the final straw. The air conditioning unit failed during a heat wave, and the repair cost was nearly $3,000. When I mentioned that maybe we should all chip in since everyone benefited from it, Dad laughed and said it was my house, my responsibility. The washing machine broke the following month, adding another expensive repair bill that somehow became mine alone to handle. I calculated that I had spent over $15,000 in the past year alone on utilities, groceries, and repairs that went beyond normal wear and tear. My savings account, once healthy, was practically empty. Meanwhile, my family members were comfortable and content, treating my house like their personal resort. The tension reached a boiling point last month when I asked if everyone could clear out for just 1 week, so I could have some alone time and maybe invite someone over without feeling like I was putting on a family reunion. The request seemed reasonable to me after 3 years of sharing my space. Mom immediately scoffed at the suggestion, telling me I was being selfish and ungrateful. She reminded me that family comes first and that I should be happy to help them during their difficult time. Dad chimed in with his characteristic bluntness, asking why I didn't just move out if I was so unhappy with the living arrangements. That comment hit me like a physical blow. Move out of my own house. The house I had worked years to buy. The house I had invited them into out of love and concern for their well-being. The house where I was now paying for everything while being treated like an unwelcome guest. My sister nodded in agreement with Dad's suggestion, adding that she had never asked me to let her stay and that I could find my own place if I wanted privacy. The casual cruelty of her words, delivered while sitting in my favorite chair in my living room. Wearing clothes bought with money she should have been contributing to household expenses, made my blood boil. I went to bed that night in my cramped former guest room, listening to my sister talking loudly on her phone in my master bedroom. and something inside me finally snapped. I had spent 3 years being the good son, the helpful brother, the accommodating homeowner. I had sacrificed my comfort, my savings, my peace of mind, and apparently my dignity in the process. That's when I remembered something my grandfather had told me years ago about never letting people mistake your kindness for stupidity. He had been a businessman who built his fortune from nothing, and he always said that the moment people start taking advantage of your generosity is the moment you need to remind them who holds the real power. I spent the night researching property law and tenant rights. What I discovered was enlightening. Since my family members had never paid rent or signed any formal agreements, they weren't technically tenants with legal protections. They were guests who had overstayed their welcome, and as the property owner, I had every right to ask them to leave. But I wanted to do more than just ask them to leave. I wanted them to understand exactly what they had been taking for granted. I wanted them to feel the same shock and displacement they had made me feel in my own home. I began planning carefully. First, I researched rental properties in the area and made note of current market rates. A 3-bedroom house like mine would rent for at least $2,500 per month, not including utilities. I calculated what my family should have been paying if this had been a legitimate living arrangement instead of a free ride. Next, I visited my lawyer to discuss the property deed transfer process. What I learned was that I could transfer ownership to someone temporarily and then have it transferred back, creating a paper trail that would make my point crystal clear. My cousin, who lived in another state and owed me several favors, agreed to help with this plan. I also contacted 3 different locksmith companies to get quotes for changing all the locks in the house. I wanted the process to be quick and professional, leaving no room for arguments or delays. For 2 weeks, I maintained my normal routine while secretly preparing. I opened a new bank account at a different bank and gradually transferred most of my remaining savings there. I researched short-term rental properties where I could stay during the transition. I even started packing my most important belongings, but carefully, so no one would notice. The hardest part was acting normal during family interactions. Dad continued treating me like a live-in maintenance man, calling me whenever something needed fixing or when he wanted help with his projects. Mom kept making expensive grocery lists and leaving them on the counter for me to handle. My sister complained about the internet speed and suggested I upgrade to a more expensive package for her streaming needs. Each interaction reinforced my conviction that I was making the right decision. They had become so comfortable with taking advantage of me that they couldn't even see how unreasonable their expectations had become. 3 weeks after Dad's suggestion that I move out if I was unhappy, I put my plan into motion. I had taken a few personal days from work, telling my boss I needed to handle some family business. The irony of that explanation wasn't lost on me. On Thursday evening, I made one final attempt at reasonable communication. I sat everyone down and explained that the current living arrangement wasn't working for me financially or emotionally. I presented them with a written breakdown of all the expenses I had been covering and suggested we either formalize a rental agreement with everyone contributing fairly or begin making plans for them to find their own places. Dad immediately dismissed my concerns, saying I was being dramatic and that family doesn't charge family rent. Mom accused me of trying to profit from their misfortune. My sister rolled her eyes and said I was acting like a landlord instead of a brother. Their responses eliminated any lingering doubt I had about my plan. That night, I packed the last of my essential belongings while they slept. I loaded everything into my car before dawn, making several trips as quietly as possible. At 6 in the morning, I drove to my cousin's house 3 hours away, where we met with a notary to complete the temporary deed transfer. By 8 a.m., the property was legally in my cousin's name, and I had written authorization to act as his property manager. I drove back to town and met the locksmith team at 9 a.m. I had prepared a brief letter explaining that the property had been transferred to new ownership and that the current occupants needed to make arrangements to collect their belongings and vacate the premises within 30 days, as required by law. The locksmith arrived exactly on schedule. I used my key to enter the house one final time, placing the letter on the kitchen counter where everyone would see it. Then I stepped outside and watched as they changed every lock on the property. Dad was the first one to wake up and discover what had happened. I watched from my car as he tried his key repeatedly, his confusion gradually turning to anger as he read my letter. He called my phone immediately, and I answered on the first ring. He demanded to know what kind of game I was playing and threatened to call the police. I calmly explained that the property had been legally transferred and that he was welcome to contact law enforcement, who would simply confirm that the current occupants were trespassing on private property without the owner's permission. Mom appeared at the front door in her bathrobe, trying to understand why her key wasn't working. The look of shock on her face when Dad explained the situation was exactly what I had hoped to see. For the first time in 3 years, they were experiencing the uncertainty and helplessness I had felt watching my own home being taken over. My sister emerged 20 minutes later, immediately launching into a screaming fit when she couldn't get inside. She called me every name imaginable, demanding I stop this ridiculous stunt and let them back in. I reminded her that she had suggested I find my own place if I wanted privacy, and that I was simply taking her advice. The beauty of my plan was its complete legality. I hadn't evicted them illegally or changed locks on tenants. I had transferred my property to a new owner who had every right to decide who could and couldn't access his house. The 30-day notice was more generous than required, since they had no legal right to be there in the first place. Update 1. The first few days were chaotic. My family tried every manipulation tactic they could think of. Dad called me repeatedly, alternating between rage and attempts at guilt tripping. He reminded me of everything he had done for me as a child, as if parenting me had been a favor that earned him lifetime free housing. Mom tried the emotional approach, crying about how cruel I was being and how this stress was affecting her health. She conveniently forgot that her health had been fine enough for her to redecorate my house and make expensive grocery demands for the past 3 years. My sister took the most predictable route, trying to turn other family members against me. She called our aunts and uncles, painting herself as the victim of my sudden and unreasonable behavior. What she didn't expect was for several of them to side with me once they heard the full story. Our uncle, Dad's brother, actually laughed when my sister called him for support. He told her that Dad had been bragging for months about how good he had it living rent-free in my house, and that it was about time someone taught him a lesson about taking advantage of family generosity. By the end of the first week, reality was setting in for all of them. Dad had contacted several landlords about rental properties, only to discover that the market rate for a 3-bedroom house was exactly what I had calculated. Mom realized that splitting utilities 4 ways in a rental would still cost them more than what I had been paying alone in my house. My sister faced the harshest awakening. Without free housing, she couldn't afford to maintain her lifestyle of minimal work and maximum spending. She would need to find full-time employment and probably roommates to manage even a basic apartment rental. They made one last attempt at negotiation through my aunt, asking if I would consider letting them back in under a formal rental agreement. I agreed to meet with them to discuss terms, but only at my lawyer's office to ensure everything would be properly documented. Update 2. The meeting at my lawyer's office was enlightening for everyone involved. I presented a detailed breakdown of what a fair rental arrangement would look like, including market rate rent split 3 ways, utilities divided equally, a security deposit, and a formal lease agreement with house rules and expectations clearly defined. The numbers were sobering. Each of them would be responsible for approximately $800 per month, plus their share of utilities, groceries, and any damages they caused. Dad's part-time income wouldn't cover his portion. Mom had no income at all. My sister's sporadic work history made her an unreliable tenant by any standard. More importantly, I had included terms that would restore my position as the homeowner. I would get my master bedroom back immediately. Common areas would be maintained according to my preferences since it was my house. Guests would need my approval. Any changes or renovations would require my written consent. The lease also included performance standards. Late rent would result in immediate eviction proceedings. Disrespectful behavior toward me in my own home would be grounds for termination of the agreement. Contributing to household expenses was mandatory, not optional. Dad's face grew redder with each term I read. He finally exploded, asking who I thought I was to dictate terms to my own family. That's when my lawyer interrupted to remind him that I was the property owner and had every right to set conditions for anyone living in my house. Mom tried to negotiate, suggesting a lower rent since they were family and not strangers. I countered by showing her the receipts for everything I had paid over the past 3 years, totaling just over $47,000. I explained that family discount was what had gotten us into this mess in the first place. My sister demanded to know why she couldn't keep the master bedroom, since she had been living there for over a year. I told her she could keep it if she wanted to pay the additional $200 per month that the master suite was worth, plus the cost of moving all her belongings out immediately so I could inspect for any damage. The meeting ended with no agreement. Dad stormed out, declaring that he would never pay rent to live in his son's house. Mom followed him, but not before telling me I had changed into someone she didn't recognize. My sister stayed long enough to ask if I was really going to let them become homeless over money. I reminded her that they had managed to live independently before moving in with me, and they would figure it out again. I also pointed out that I had given them 30 days notice, which was more consideration than they had shown me when taking over my house. Update 3. The 30 days passed more quickly than anyone expected. Dad found a small apartment across town that he could afford with his part-time income, but it meant giving up most of the hobbies and projects that had filled my garage. Mom would be living with him in a one-bedroom space, a significant downgrade from the comfortable arrangement they had enjoyed at my expense. My sister struggled the most with the transition. She eventually found a room in a shared house with 3 other women, all of whom had strict rules about cleanliness, noise, and overnight guests. The reality of having roommates who wouldn't tolerate her entitled behavior was a harsh adjustment. The most satisfying part of the entire experience was watching them realize exactly what they had lost. Dad called me 2 weeks after moving out, not to apologize, but to complain about his new living situation. His apartment was too small, the neighbors were too loud, and he missed having a garage for his projects. I listened politely, and then reminded him that he had always been welcome to stay in my house under reasonable terms. He had chosen pride over practicality, and now he was living with the consequences of that choice. Mom tried a different approach, suggesting that we could work something out now that they had learned their lesson. She offered to pay a small amount of rent if I would consider letting them move back in. I told her I would think about it, but only under the original lease terms I had proposed. My sister made no attempt at reconciliation. She was apparently telling anyone who would listen that I had kicked my own family out onto the street over greed. The family members who knew the real story weren't buying her victim narrative, but she seemed committed to maintaining it anyway. 6 weeks after regaining control of my house, I transferred the deed back to my name and had the locks changed again for security. Walking through my own home without having to navigate around other people's belongings felt like breathing fresh air after being underwater. I spent the first week just enjoying the silence. No one demanding I fix things that weren't broken. No one rearranging my furniture or complaining about my lifestyle choices. No crushing utility bills or grocery expenses that left me financially stressed. The master bedroom felt like a luxury hotel after months of sleeping in the cramped guest room. I could shower without worrying about hot water running out. I could cook what I wanted to eat without accommodating 3 other people's preferences and dietary restrictions. Most importantly, I had learned a valuable lesson about the difference between helping family and enabling them to take advantage of me. True emergencies require temporary solutions, but comfort and convenience shouldn't come at the expense of the person providing the help. My relationship with my family would probably never be the same, and I found that I was completely at peace with that reality. Respect has to be mutual, even in family relationships. Love doesn't give anyone the right to exploit someone else's generosity indefinitely. The house feels like home again, and I've started dating someone who appreciates having a partner with boundaries and self-respect. Dad's suggestion that I move out if I was unhappy had been intended as a dismissive insult, but it had actually inspired the perfect solution. Sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to change the entire game instead of trying to win by someone else's rules.